I'm going to start. Welcome, everybody, to the Educators Room Do the Work. We are here tonight with our guest, Dr. Nathan Clemens. It is a Sunday. We are the Sunday before Thanksgiving, so we are hopeful that teachers are out for the holidays. But I know some of our colleagues around the nation have to work Monday, Tuesday, Wednesday. But we're going to talk about dyslexia today, and this is something that's near and dear to my heart. For those of you who know, I have a child that has dyslexia, so all the research, everything, I'm always reading through it. And so I was really happy to find this special issue focused on dyslexia. And Dr. Clemens, it came out in May, right?
I
Published in
think
May.
so. Yeah,
Yeah,
the electronic version came out earlier, so I'm not quite sure when exactly it was, but the print version may have been in May. Mhm.
absolutely. So
Mhm.
before we start and dig deep into this, all this research, give us a little bit about your background, your research, is anything that we need to know about you and your work.
Sure. Yeah. So thank you. It's good to be here and good to be talking with you all for a little while. So my name is Nathan Clemens. And I'm a professor in the Department of Special Education at the University of Texas at Austin. Our Department of Special Education is within the College of Education at UT Austin. So I'm a professor there. Also affiliated with the Meadows Center for Preventing Educational Risk. It's a research facility that is housed within the College of Education at UT Austin. And so um, I have projects that are situated in the Meadows Center and colleagues there and so on. Um, so in terms of my work, I study reading development, particularly reading difficulties. I have an interest in word level reading difficulties, i.e. dyslexia for students in early grade levels. And also I do some work for students with reading comprehension difficulties in adolescence, particularly in middle school. And so I have a number of projects and studies going on in those areas. That work involves both intervention, studying new approaches, new techniques, new strategies for improving reading outcomes for either students with word reading difficulties or reading comprehension. And I'm also involved in work in assessment there as well. So I'm originally from Pennsylvania. I grew up there, but I've been in Texas since 2009. My first faculty position was at Texas A&M University in the Department of Educational Psychology. I was there from 2009 to 2016, and then I've been at UT Austin since 2016. So,
Perfect. Wow, just so much expertise around this. So before we start, guys, I'm going to put the link to the special edition in the chat. But can you talk about like what was the main purpose of this special issue in the Reading Research Quarterly, and why is it so important for us to look at the current evidence on dyslexia? Because I'm in Georgia, but I've been all throughout the Southeast, and dyslexia has become in the school setting, there has been a lot of legislation that is starting to come up about the science of reading and how we teach reading, and there has been this focus. And
mhm.
so, what was the main purpose on this?
Sure. So the special issue, so again, this appeared in Reading Research Quarterly. And for those of you that are not familiar with the idea, so occasionally a journal, a peer-reviewed journal may periodically do a special issue. That might be an issue that's devoted to a particular topic or particular question or theme. And so in this particular case, Reading Research Quarterly was interested in a special issue on dyslexia. In fact, my colleague and I, Sharon Bond, Dr. Sharon Bond, who's also here at UT Austin, we had the idea for a special issue on dyslexia that came, not too long after Reading Research Quarterly had done another set of special issues on the science of reading. They actually had two special issues on the science of reading and a lot of really important influential articles that appeared in those special issues. And so, um, we thought this would be a good time for a special issue, particularly around dyslexia, pulling together contemporary research on around assessment, identification, around intervention, and other aspects related to dyslexia. So it was really, and you mentioned the science of reading legislation, and really that kind of drove the interest in our interest in perhaps in co-editing a special issue, but as well as the journal's interest in also taking that on and doing it. So Sharon and I, we were guest co-editors, basically. So for this special issue, there was a call for articles. Author teams submitted proposals. We reviewed the proposals. We accepted a set. Then the articles came in. It went through the peer review process with those articles that came in. With the set that made it through the peer review process, that's ultimately what ended up in the special issue. The particular article that I think you might be linking to is the article that Sharon and I wrote that was introducing the special issue. That's where we describe the articles in it, the overall giving an overall summary of the work and so on. But we also took that opportunity to talk about some current issues, some lingering misconceptions, some persistent myths, as well as also understandings around dyslexia and things that are out there. And so really those kinds of things drove our interest in the special issue, the journal's interest in taking it on. And hopefully readers and individuals, both in the research and practice sides of things, are finding it useful.
I was muted. Guys, I've linked the article here for you guys to read it, to peruse it. So I want to ask this. So for people who are not watching, what is the definition of dyslexia? Because we have kids who have reading issues, right? And it's not necessarily dyslexia. And with all of this talk, what is the definition of dyslexia that you guys use in the research world? Because sometimes in public schools, any kid who has reading issues it can be lumped into a child with specific learning, this SLD, specific learning disorder, or they just assume dyslexia.
Yeah. So typically in our work, and I think a lot of other researchers would adhere to the definition that the International Dyslexia Association has used for quite some time. And that definition basically says that dyslexia is a specific learning disability that involves significant difficulties reading and spelling words. That's the first portion of the definition, and I think is the most important and salient. That dyslexia is a specific learning disability. And its primary characteristics, its hallmark defining features are significant difficulties reading and spelling words, individual words. And those two, that if I have time, I can get into it, but those reading and spelling difficulties are intermixed, they're interlinked because they rely on a foundation of common skills. But I think it's important to remember that dyslexia is a specific learning disability. There have been a lot of areas around the country that have not used the dyslexia term per se, but have long identified specific learning disability and basic reading. We're talking about the same thing. Specific learning disability and basic reading is dyslexia. That's how it's always been viewed from the research side of the continuum. And I think more recently there has become, I think, sort of a perception that dyslexia is different from a specific learning disability, and that's never been the case. And so really, when you talk about dyslexia, you're talking about specific learning disability. Sometimes people might refer to it more specifically as specific learning disability and basic reading.
That's interesting to know because it's interesting you said that people don't want to use the word dyslexia because for my own child, I knew something was amiss in about kindergarten, first grade, but it was very hard. We'll talk about my story in a minute, but it was very interesting in that when you go through public schools, a lot of people don't want to use the word dyslexia. So that's always interesting for me. Guys, we have Aileen who says, will the recording be forwarded? Yes, we have this recording. You can find it on our YouTube, our social media. So it will be there. But guys, put your questions in the chat. We have a researcher, we have an expert on this. And any questions that you guys have, I think will be helpful because there's someone who's listening to this who's saying, I have an inkling, I just don't know. So, can we talk about how the understanding of dyslexia has evolved over the years and like some misconceptions that persist even today?
Mhm.
Because as a teacher, for background, I taught high school English for over 15, 20 years. Went into administration, worked at the district level, and I was never taught about dyslexia in my studies to become a teacher, grad,
Mhm.
undergrad. So,
Mhm.
how has the understanding of dyslexia evolved?
Sure. Yeah. So um, I think over the years, again, dyslexia being synonymous with specific learning disability, and for those that are maybe in a similar position, with less knowledge of dyslexia per se, but perhaps more knowledge about specific learning disability, again, we're talking about the same thing.
Mhm,
In terms of evolution of understanding, and there's been significant progress in understanding reading development. And with that comes an understanding of how reading skill difficulties can arise, how reading skill difficulties break down, or how reading skill difficulties occur. And that really speaks to understanding around understanding what the mechanisms are in dyslexia and what's happening. There's a good deal of understanding that's come out in the past few decades around the importance of phonological and phonemic awareness. That's our perception of the sound structure of language,
mhm,
and hearing individual sounds within words. Right? We hear that in the word cat, there's multiple sounds within it when we say the word cat, and so a recognition of that, and then evidence that students with individuals with dyslexia often have difficulties with perceiving and doing things with the sounds in language. Phonological processing
mhm,
difficulties are a characteristic, not exclusively, but tend to be a common characteristic of individuals with dyslexia. And those the importance of phonemic awareness really comes in the initiation of reading skill development. As you hear the sounds in cat, um, you are perhaps in a better position to be able to link those sounds that you hear with printed letters,
mhm,
and then be able to do things with those sounds in learning to read and spell words. Learning to sound out words often involves sounding them out into segments and then blending the sounds back together. Taking a word you're asked to spell, again, you're kind of breaking it down into sounds and then representing the sounds that you hear with printed letters. And so if you have difficulties perceiving the sound structure of language, you can see how that would have have some bearing on difficulty in learning to associate print with sound, and then doing things with letters in reading and spelling. And so, certainly there's been progress on that over the years. I think also understanding of dyslexia from intervention standpoints, and we can get to that in a little bit, in terms of what's effective, but there's still a lot of questions that remain in that respect.
mhm,
Um, and I think the question also asked about misconceptions that persist, right?
mhm.
And I think there's a number, and then we address this in the introduction to the special issue, Sharon and I's paper. Um, I think there's a number, and I can briefly touch on them, and
Yeah.
if there's interest in me going a little bit deeper, I'm happy to.
I think there
Um,
is interest. I think that people want to know. I think people want to know that because we get so much noise around it. So we want to hear that.
Sure, yeah. And so we pointed out some, and I'll note some here. So the first is around prevalence. What more contemporary studies on the prevalence of dyslexia tend to find is that it occurs in about 5 to 10% of the population.
Mhm,
Very often you'll hear 1 in 5 or 1 in 4,
mhm,
which tend to be overestimates compared to what larger, more contemporary studies have found. So 5 to 10%. So it's not as prevalent as some of those earlier estimates indicate, but nevertheless, it is still the most common, most frequently identified disability in K to 12 education.
mhm,
Learning disabilities are by far the most identified type of disability. And then within learning disability, reading specifically, and specifically word level difficulties, i.e., dyslexia, are the most common. So even though the rate is 5 to 10%, that still makes it the most common, commonly identified disability.
mhm,
Um, we talked about we mentioned this in the article, the myths and misunderstandings surrounding visual processing in dyslexia. There are persistent misunderstandings that dyslexia is arising and is caused by problems in vision or visual processing.
Mm-hmm.
And there's evidence just doesn't support that.
Mm-hmm.
The problem is that hypothesis, this notion that dyslexia is caused by problems in visual processing, led to a number of approaches that don't have evidence of effectiveness. For instance, colored lenses or overlays. This idea that we have transparent colored overlays that we put over text, or colored eyeglasses that we're using. That idea stems from this idea that around visual processing, but there's no evidence supporting that it has benefit for individuals with dyslexia or reading overall. You may have come across special fonts developed over the years. There's one font called Dyslexia. There's another called Open Dyslexic. These were created by graphic designers. They hypothesized that these fonts would make reading easier, based on the shape of the letters, the spacing, and so on. Studies have indicated that there's no difference in individuals' reading skills when reading in special fonts versus typical fonts like Times New Roman or Arial. Nor do individuals prefer the special fonts. One of the thoughts around developing the special font is that it makes it easier and makes reading more enjoyable. Actually, they ask participants to rate which one they like better, and participants tend to rate the Times New Romans or Arial fonts better than these special dyslexic fonts that people developed. There's been recommendations around vision therapy over the years. A number of pediatric ophthalmologist groups in medicine have come out with statements saying that these approaches are not effective. Anything that's focused solely on the visual modality around visual processing is not an effective approach to treating dyslexia. So by and large, as you are encountering approaches and interventions, if it's something focused solely on vision and visual processing, it's unlikely to be effective. Vision is certainly involved in reading, right? In reading, that's how signals get in. But ultimately, in reading, everything about reading, it's being processed by, in many cases, the language centers of the brain, most likely, often. So, we also mentioned in the paper the perception that multisensory types of programs are necessary for individual dyslexia, or the gold standard approach. There's lots of notions out there that interventions for students with dyslexia need to be multisensory or have to be. And in fact, that's written into legislation across a number of states that individuals with dyslexia need a multisensory based reading program. So far, the evidence doesn't say that multisensory programs are any more effective statistically than programs that are not multisensory. And so it's still an open question. There's a number of programs out there that are effective at improving reading skills for students with significant reading difficulties that aren't multisensory in nature. I think what it comes down to is that effective approaches tend to be focused on explicit phonics instruction, on direct, explicit instruction in teaching students the links between letters and sounds, how to use that information to read and spell words, and that provide tons and tons of practice with support in reading. So those tend to be where the evidence is now. Those tend to be the common denominators of programs that tend to be more effective. I think the issue around multisensory is that there's often the argument that, in multisensory activities where students are engaged with multiple senses, auditory, visual, kinesthetic, and tactile, that it promotes more engagement. And that's probably true, but that's true in instruction, that we're having students do things in multiple and different ways. Where I think it becomes a problem is that when schools, when teachers feel like they need to spend additional resources or time in doing things like writing in sand trays or doing things with pool noodles and buying additional resources and feeling like they have to involve movement in every single case, or tactile in every single case. And it's just not the case so far that evidence indicates that multisensory instruction is any more effective than non-multisensory.
That's interesting. I want to pause right there because I can remember my daughter is now 15, and I can remember a lot of people telling me she needed the multi, but it didn't work for her. And as an educator, I did not, and I'll say this, and people in the comments they can say whatever. I just didn't feel like it was a viable way to teach her how to read properly.
Mm.
And I know it made people feel good because if they're because I saw some teachers with like Play-Doh and like just different things, and I was like, I don't know the evidence that this is going to really help her.
Mm-hmm.
So that's interesting. So I wanted to say that.
Yeah, and I want to clarify too. Many students and many studies have found that multisensory programs result in benefits in reading
Mhm.
outcomes. I'm not implying that they're not effective. What I'm saying is that there's not evidence saying that these have to be done, right? There's not evidence saying that they're necessary. That it's not clear that they're any better than other programs that aren't multisensory. So
That's interesting because someone just put in the comments. This is Holly. We have a couple people from Houston, Washington State, Oregon. Holly says, "Can you tell us some of the best evidence-based curricula?" I listen. This in throughout the United States, there's been this rush to say who teaches what curriculum would best benefit children with dyslexia. If
mm-hmm.
you're comfortable, you can name them. If you're not, it's fine. Also, do you like what are some of the I guess to me a better question or a question that you might want to answer more is like what are some of the hallmarks of a curriculum
Mm-hmm.
that is evidence based that will help students with dyslexia?
Sure. Yeah, so I think this question is, I mean, it's constantly evolving because, we need more evidence on specific programs. Where most of the research has been conducted over the years is around components and elements of instruction,
Mm,
right? Around the importance of phonemic awareness, the importance of explicit instruction in phonics, the importance of including spelling, different forms of reading practice. We know a little bit more about those components than we do about a specific branded program, right?
mm,
But there still is evidence out there, and I would encourage people to look at resources and sites such as the What Works Clearinghouse.
yeah.
What Works Clearinghouse is a location to go to. What Works Clearinghouse, in conjunction with the Institutes for Education Sciences in the U.S. Department of Education, has also put out a series of fantastic resources called practice guides. These are the What Works Clearinghouse IES practice guides. They're available in multiple areas, not just in reading, but in mathematics and behavior and so on. But they are fantastic, very user-friendly guides that distill contemporary evidence, high-quality research into a set of recommendations on what to do. Um, so there's a practice guide that was led by Barb Foreman from the Florida Center for Reading Research on basic reading instruction and intervention. There's another one more recently that my colleague Sharon Vaughn led on reading intervention for students after grade 4. So I would look at that. You can also look at What Works Clearinghouse for reviews of particular programs. One program that stands out in particular is the Sound Partners program.
Mm,
It was led by Patricia Vaddisy. Sound Partners tends to be one of the more empirically supported interventions for students with word reading difficulties in early grade levels.
mm,
It is, I mean, no surprise, it's explicit phonics instruction. It's explicit high quality instruction, supplemental intervention for students with significant word reading difficulties, focused on decoding. It involves spelling, involves lots of reading practice. But that's one that the What Works Clearinghouse has reviewed, and multiple studies support its efficacy. Um,
mm.
and so, I think as a resource and for others looking at specific programs, going to What Works Clearinghouse, and its chances are they may have reviewed it, they may not have, but they'll indicate the level of evidence there and their recommendations around it.
Yeah. Thank you for that. I appreciate that because sometimes, and this is one of the reasons, guys, that we interview researchers because we're not interested in you guys spending money on things that do not work, especially when you're talking about children and you're talking about helping kids become better readers. And so I like that there is
Mhm.
a clear. I knew there was the What Works Clearinghouse, but I had never heard of SoundWorks. Is it SoundWorks?
Sound partners.
Sound partners. So that's
Mhm.
something I'm going to look into. But it's important for us because I think sometimes when we have these problems, especially or these issues in education, we're looking for give me the package, give me the program that is packaged up that I can just do and it's going to help my kids. And so I
Mhm.
like when you talk about there are different components in going that.
Yeah.
So go ahead.
Sure. And something about, and there's a couple more of the misconceptions that I want to hit before we move
Okay,
on.
go
And
ahead.
this ties in a little bit with Sound Partners, but Sound Partners was developed to be picked up and used pretty readily by individuals who don't have extensive background, which I think makes it very attractive for schools that lack individuals with significant training and background. It was actually designed and had been used in many situations by paraprofessionals. It's really how it's designed, and so I think that also speaks to another common misperception in this space is that individuals that work with students with dyslexia need to have specific credentials, need to have a certain license or qualification. Really, what it comes down to is a good program, a program with key core elements and explicit phonics instruction and lots of reading practice, and then someone who is experienced in working with kids and knows and but is able to follow that program. I think are the common features that
Yeah.
to date we don't have evidence, and there certainly aren't laws yet saying that individuals who support children with or at risk for dyslexia need to have a specific credential.
Yeah. Yeah, that's important. I like that, especially when you said that paraprofessionals can use it because you're also seeing this movement of parents who maybe are homeschooling and or not their kids aren't in traditional schools, and so
Mhm.
this makes it accessible to those families also.
Absolutely. Mm-hmm.
So, can we talk about a little bit? Do we have all of the common misconceptions or any other ones that you want to touch on?
I think that's good for now. If there's any others people have questions about, I can answer later, but I think we're good for now.
Absolutely. So, can we talk about some of the key challenges of diagnosing dyslexia
Mhm.
and how early identification can benefit our kiddos with dyslexia?
Sure. So, diagnosing dyslexia formally shares the same kind of problems as with any form of learning
Mm,
disability. Um, there has been, over the past several decades, rather vehement debates on how learning disabilities should be identified. A number of different models have come with a lot of controversy around them. Some of the historical models around learning disability identification involve discrepancies between a student's scores on an intelligence or intellectual ability achieve or intellectual um, assessment versus their academic skills. And when that large discrepancy is present, a formal label is applied, and when it isn't, that formal label is denied. There's been a number of problems noted and observed with a model like that. Other approaches are around. Some of you may have heard of and come across the response intervention approach that evaluates an individual's response to high quality instruction as a way of informing whether or not more intensive levels of support might be needed and whether or not an individual qualifies and is eligible for special education under a disability type of label. Um, it's the challenge comes down to really is that it's a dimensional disorder. Learning
mm,
disabilities, dyslexia occur on a continuum. It is unlike there are no specific markers, right? It is
mm,
unlike other disability categories that have genetic markers to them,
mm,
Fragile X, right? Down syndrome,
right.
other types of conditions like cancer, where we can point to something that says, this is the condition, right?
Yeah.
When you have something like learning disability, in the same way that you have hypertension, it exists on a continuum, and it becomes an issue when it becomes more and more severe. There's not a clear line. There's not a clear demarcation. There's not a score on a particular test that says, yes, this individual has dyslexia versus they don't. And that really, is a challenge to its identification in all forms of learning disability. Another challenge to dyslexia in terms of early identification is thinking about its defining and hallmark features. Its defining characteristics are difficulties reading and spelling words. And so if you think about the development of reading skills in young children, in order to identify an individual who has significant difficulties reading words, you have to have the student who's old enough that they've at least had an opportunity to receive that kind of instruction, and that their peers are demonstrating some level of proficiency, so that this individual you can say, yeah, they're having difficulty, right? And so, by and large, that we don't really expect some degree of beginning word reading proficiency until, say, middle or first grade at the earliest, even later. And so for a disorder and for a disability that's defined by word reading skills, that poses challenges to early identification. However, we do have a lot of evidence that we can identify risk for dyslexia earlier. While formal identification may not be possible in kindergarten, we can at least identify students who are showing some characteristics that may say they're at risk for it in the future. Difficulties with learning to associate letters with sounds, difficulties in phonemic awareness, difficulties in learning these skills, despite the fact that there's been some decent instruction going on in their classroom. And then especially in later kindergarten, early first grade, if they're not picking up these skills to be able to read words, frequent errors, reading is a challenge, much more so than their peers, because reading will be difficult for most kids, right? But now you can start to look at risk for dyslexia, and preventative interventions can be put into place before a formal identification is possible.
Yeah, that's interesting, because that brought up to me. So I guess I have to ask this: Is it safe for us, because we're in a state of crisis in a lot of communities? I would say all throughout the United States around reading, right? And I'll say that from a teacher perspective, in that I don't know. I'll say this confidently. There's not been a evidence-based way of teaching reading in most schools. So sometimes it has previously been whoever has the best curriculum, that is the most economical, that has all the bells and whistles, that is pushed onto teachers. And so, whereas when I grew up, learning how to read was about how do this, the different parts of the word, the sounds of letters, all of that. There was a time in American education for extensive amount of time where kids were told that they will just catch on to reading. It'll catch on. If you give them time, they'll learn how to read. It'll happen. It'll almost happen by osmosis, right? What we found, and this is strictly from an educator's view, is that we have left a lot of kids behind because we have not been systematic in how we teach reading, right? Um, so is it safe to say that how you teach a child with dyslexia how to read is also good for kids who do not have dyslexia?
Yeah, that's great. I'm glad you brought that up. I would say absolutely. Effective reading instruction is just that. Effective reading is effective, period. Um, the core elements of what make an effective core instruction approach, a core curricula for all students learning to read, tend to be very similar to effective approaches for individuals with significant reading difficulties. That tends to be explicit phonics instruction, phonemic awareness that's embedded with print, opportunities to read and spell words, and tons of reading practice with support from a skilled reader, a skilled teacher. And I think you're exactly right that those core elements aren't very different. Where the intervention looks different is usually that it's more explicit, it's more intensive, it involves more frequent review. It's usually done in smaller groups or one-to-one. It's just taking those key elements and making it more intensive, more explicit, more direct. But I think, you mentioned the challenges to reading instruction across the country, that I'm hopeful and optimistic that the science of reading movement has having an influence in changing. But the number one approach to preventing significant reading difficulties, preventing dyslexia, is firming up, is improving, and and what's happening in kindergarten, first and second grade is
Mhm.
providing effective scientifically based reading instruction that in many cases can mitigate perhaps some genetic influence around dyslexia, around some difficulties in coming to school with challenges in basic skills. But that first step towards large scale systemic prevention and support comes from classroom teachers implementing effective reading instruction in kindergarten, first and second grade.
Yeah, yeah. And it seems so simple. And I have to ask you this, and it's okay if you don't answer this. Um, it seems so simple, and I think, and what I'm hopeful is that this slew of legislation around literacy and science of reading and making sure we're using evidence-based practices is something that I'm hopeful will catch on. And I'm hopeful that this will encourage districts and systems and teachers and parents to take the complexity out of it. Learning to read is very complex, right? But the complexity of that you need 30 different resources to teach a child how to read.
Mm-hmm.
My question is that because I've said this and I have data, empirical data that I've collected as an educator. Again, this is just my thoughts, is that some of the things that have taught kids how to read, or the focus on, guessing a word and all these things that came out, are things that I don't want to say have merit. That's not what I mean, but have a place downward when kids are taught properly how to read.
Mm-hmm.
Have you found that like some of these, because there was a whole language movement, right?
Mm-hmm.
And one of the things that I constantly have used to have arguments with my colleagues around was, until you teach a child how to read, none of that matters,
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm.
because you're spinning their wheels and you're confusing them even more. What are your
Right.
thoughts on that?
Yeah. So, I think what I haven't mentioned, and I should have already, I should have to this point, but when I talk about effective instruction, that you're never leaving the language out. That students' language skills are immensely important and will intersect with their learning the alphabetic code to develop reading proficiency. So continuing to focus and build students' vocabulary knowledge, their background knowledge, um, taking words that they know and kind of linking that to other words that mean similar things, talking about background knowledge and learning vocabulary in those areas, that really kind of feeds into their development of reading as they're learning the alphabetic code, as they're receiving phonics instruction, and they're able to sound out a word and attempt the pronunciation. Children that have a stronger bank of knowledge to draw from, more word knowledge, more vocabulary knowledge, are in a better position to link that pronunciation to a meaning. Or if their pronunciation is not quite right or is imperfect, they're in a better position to adapt it in a certain way because
Mm,
they have that understanding. And I think, as you mentioned, three queuing, which has been, in many cases been pointed to as a hallmark of whole language
yeah.
approaches. But as children are learning to read and as they are learning the code, there is, they're reading text, reading sentences, reading passages, building a mental image of what's happening in the brain. And there's confirmation coming in as they're reading words that things are kind of checking out.
Mhm.
They are using context to recognize when they've read words correctly and also to help them monitor when they've read things incorrectly. And when they have read something incorrectly, their understanding is helping them to recognize that and then go back and fix it up. And so, in my daughter's in third grade, and as she was learning to read, I didn't shy away from referring to pictures, but I always did it after she read the word. We did some things at home that I was using to help supplement her reading.
Yeah.
But she'd read a sentence, and then I had something where in a PowerPoint where an image would appear that related to the sentence. So after
Mm,
she had sounded it out and after she had decoded, then she saw the picture that supported the meaning, right? And so it's kind of like that. Like I tell people that, yeah, you can refer to context, you can refer to illustrations, but use it in support of what they have just read. Don't use it as a cue to guess at what the words are, but use it as a way to confirm that they read it correctly and also help to contribute to that understanding of what they've just read in that sentence or in that passage.
yeah, yeah, and that's kind of and that is that's my worry with the science of reading movement. I
Mm-hmm.
don't want us to move so far away that we forget about content. I mean, not content, but context, and visualizing background knowledge.
Mm-hmm.
It's firmly in the middle, right? So as we think about that and as we talk about that, I'm glad that you confirmed that. And I know there are some people on here. I'm getting lots of handshakes on here, so
Mm-hmm.
people are agreeing. But put your, as we're asking these questions, I'm asking these questions. Please put your own thoughts, some questions that you have, because we only have about 20 more minutes. It is the holiday week, but we needed to have this conversation. Um, can we talk about teacher training and classroom instruction on students with dyslexia and this
Mm-hmm.
special issue that came out? Can we talk about how this issue can help positively impact how we're training teachers now, classroom instruction, and just how we support students with dyslexia?
Mm-hmm. Sure. Yeah, so the special issue included a set of literature reviews slash meta analyses. Um, there was one in particular by Colby Hall and her colleagues that summarized several decades of intervention research, and that's a very useful meta-analysis. But Tim Shanahan had also reviewed um, he did sort of a review of reviews, basically, looking at previous meta-analyses on instruction just in general, on effective forms of instruction that would support children with or at risk for dyslexia in general education settings. And so Tim Shanahan's article is really helpful, I think, particularly for this question, and helps to highlight some things that I think reaffirm what the science of reading movement has been talking about,
Mm-hmm.
but also talking about some next steps and things we need to determine. But I think again, it comes down to the value of phonics instruction, that at least a portion of your instruction is focused on the alphabetic code, and teaching children to associate letters with sounds, to use that information to read and spell words. Um, and that most children will benefit and most children need it. Students with significant difficulty or at risk, it's
Mm-hmm.
essential, right? And
Yeah.
so if you have a system, if you have a core curriculum across your building, across your school, your district, where it sets this up in systematic, explicit instruction in this way, I think you're going a long way in supporting all children, and particularly kids with or at risk for significant difficulties.
That's I appreciate you saying that because as people are as people pick up this issue, my hope is that you did like I did and you took it out and you started underlining and reading it for your own knowledge, right? Just to affirm things that you knew, discover things like, hey, I didn't know that. Um, and I really hope because sometimes there's this disconnect between what I know, what I believe to be true, and what evidence says, right? Um, what when you talk about this special issue and the strategies and interventions that are discussed, can we talk a little bit about that? Like, what are the strategies and interventions to improve outcomes for students, and not
Mm-hmm.
only in the classroom but also in their daily lives?
Mm-hmm. Yeah, I think, and that's where I think our issue is perhaps a little limited in terms of giving a precise checklist on what to do. I think it's more of like kind of looking across the articles and then kind of looking at our introduction to the special issue to kind of get at that. But I think it's a lot of those things that I've been mentioning around the importance of explicit instruction, the importance of considering um, extensive reading practice. I think also questioning perhaps some some commonly held notions um, around support and instruction for individuals with dyslexia. I think if you're seeing things in your schools where you have interventions that are focused on like vision processing again, if you have interventions that are trying to target uh, quote unquote brain training or working
Mhm.
memory, anything that, in so many areas in what we do, you get what you teach, right?
Yeah. Yep.
If you want reading outcomes, you teach reading, and you do it more and more explicitly the more and more kids need it. Um, the importance of practice, I think, is I don't. I know people recognize the importance of practicing reading, but I'm not sure if we really do. I talk a lot about explicit instruction, and that's key. But I think what really drives the bus is kids actually reading text and reading it out loud while there's a skilled individual there to help to reinforce, to provide affirmative feedback as they're correctly reading, and provide immediate corrective feedback as needed as errors occur.
Mhm.
Kids, the teaching is needed, to help them make those connections. But then
Yeah.
that practice they need of
Yeah.
getting tons and tons of opportunities to read words is essential.
I like that you said that because there's a lot of talk around intervention and what does it look like. Intervention is not 14 kids to one teacher.
Mm-hmm.
It's not. It is a small group. It is, in my opinion, no more than five, and that to me is a lot, right? Especially when you're trying to help remediate a child in their area that they need it in. And so, can
Mm-hmm.
you talk a little bit more about like what does evidence tell us that remediation looks like for students with dyslexia or any child with a reading disability?
What mediation looks like in terms of the approaches.
The approaches, the structure, just anything that you can give us because
Mhm.
we're getting that's in my opinion there's we have a lot to learn in that area on what it looks like in a classroom. So what are
Right.
your thoughts as a researcher on what it looks like and what you guys know that works the best?
Yeah. I think you're right about small group instruction. I think simply from a logistical standpoint, when you have students in which you need to focus more intensive energy toward, it's just more conducive in a small group. And when you think about small group or one-to-one, there's actually what the evidence indicates is there's not many big distinctions between one-to-one intervention versus small group intervention, say like
Mm,
2 to 5. um, a number of studies have indicated that really the outcomes for small group interventions were just as strong as one-to-one.
mm,
So overall, there's that piece. I think, that type of intervention, I think ideally involves teaching letters and letter combinations, how to use that and read that in words. I think it involves a lot of practice reading words both in isolation. So students should have practice being able to sound out and read words individually, but then
mm,
also immediately in the same lesson, also read
yeah,
those words in context, read
yeah,
those words in sentences and in passages to the extent that they can. It involves integrating spelling with decoding instruction. So students should have the opportunity to read words, but they should also have the opportunity to spell them as well. Um, and that spelling knowledge can help contribute potentially to learning to read words. I think also, and I think there'll be more research coming out on this, and we're working on some right now. But um, stronger integration of semantic information and
mm,
vocabulary knowledge within decoding instruction.
okay,
I think a lot of times we think about um, decoding instruction as focused on just reading the words accurately and getting a correct pronunciation. That's
yeah,
a huge step we need. But I think, can we also come in and talk about what those words mean, like briefly use that word in a
mm-hmm.
sentence, helping kids to say, "Oh yeah, I've heard that before." Does that perhaps create a stronger bond in memory? There's some evidence to suggest that perhaps that might be the case. Um, so I think those kinds of things is just lots of work, explicit instruction, lots of practice, and lots
Yeah.
of feedback from the teacher constantly.
I like when you talked about that because um the idea that kids need not only learn someone sitting there with them helping them correctly pronounce a word and then talking about its meaning because sometimes we forget that, like you said earlier, that kids need that association. Like, what does this word mean?
Mm-hmm.
And visualizing it. So that's important. All right, guys, we
Right.
got like 12 minutes because I have to get them out of here by 7. So I got to get through these questions. Please put your comments. Okay, so the next question that I have is really around, the consequences of misunderstanding dyslexia. Like, we see just, and this is from my viewpoint in education, is that we see a lot of kids who have reading issues, who are in trouble, who have lots of discipline issues. We know that when we go to jails, we find people who cannot read and have reading issues. I don't know if they're dyslexic or not. What are
Mm-hmm.
some of the potential consequences if we really don't get a clear understanding of dyslexia, for our society, but also, for more importantly, for the students, the kiddos, the adults
Mm-hmm.
who have these reading issues that have
Mm-hmm.
never been remediated?
Yeah. Yeah, and I'll be brief. I mean, the prevalence alone is what speaks to the importance of it. You know, when you have 5 to 10% of the population potentially having significant difficulties reading words, you can imagine what that can do for outcomes
Mhm.
in terms of school. You know, it makes school achievement so much more difficult. Significant reading difficulties are associated more strongly with school dropout, with
Yep.
school failure. We know then, kind of linking that chain, school dropout is associated with juvenile delinquency and contact with the juvenile justice system, unemployment. It involves fewer opportunities for post school educational opportunities as well as career options, and so it's really ultimately a societal, something society needs to care about
Yeah.
significantly. It comes down to funding, making sure schools are resourced, that highly trained teachers, highly effective teachers are attracted, supported, and retained. It involves in scientifically based reading instruction and systems of support. That the effective core instruction you have, and then you have layers potentially of intervention in schools. Many of you may come across multi-tiered systems of support. And that's
Mm-hmm.
really the MTSS model, is that approach, is that to have multi layers of support needed for individuals to improve core instruction as well as so anyway, the consequences are significant from a societal standpoint, and something we just can't ignore.
Yeah, and we one of the things that we know about this is that many school systems across the country have gotten billions of dollars in federal aid from after COVID-19 for learning loss. Right, a lot of districts have been using that money to remediate kids. So this is the time. This is the
Mhm.
time when we have these funds that we can help close the gap. We have 9 minutes left. So I want to be as effective as possible. I know we have a couple more questions that we could get to, but right now somebody is reading this, whether it's a parent, whether it's a teacher, who says, you know what, I have some kiddos right now who I know in my heart of heart are either they're dyslexic or they just have tremendous reading issues. What would you tell that teacher, that parent, to do right now?
Um, find
Sorry
ways
to put you on the
of
spot.
yeah, no, find ways of increasing the amount of time they can practice reading with someone there to listen to them read.
Mm,
That's a short answer. More would be needed, right? I
yeah.
think, though, from a school standpoint, a teacher recognizing that, getting in touch with their referral process, understanding what types of referrals are needed. School psychologists can help in those
Mhm.
situations. Also, if you're seeing, if say you're a second grade teacher and you're seeing so many kids come into your second grade with significant reading difficulties, bring that to the attention of your grade level teams, your
Mhm.
district leads. What's happening in earlier grade levels? What's not happening that we need to address?
Yeah.
For parents, I think thinking about programs that are out there that you can do at home, like
Mhm.
Sound Partners, like some other resources that are out there. Again, the practice is key. Children's attention to letters and letter sounds, sounding words out, all of that is still very, very relevant for parents out there that learned under the phonics approach. That's
Yeah.
absolutely what the children need going forward.
Yeah.
And I'll just throw this in here real quick in case we do get cut off. But Francesca, feel free to share my email here. I put it in
Okay.
the chat. You can share that with all the people attending. If there's something we didn't get to in terms of a question you have, those listening, please feel free to email me.
Yeah, and I appreciate you saying that because that's much more definitive. Um, Helping kids practice to read, and I know I'm summarizing it. Helping kids practice to read with somebody there that can correct them.
Mm-hmm.
And I've said this, so this is something that I've been preaching this for a long time. Is that kids don't become better readers; they only become better readers by reading.
Yeah,
That's it.
exactly.
There's
Mm-hmm.
there's no magic formula. And what I tell superintendents and what I tell people when I talk to them is that if your priority is not making sure kids have books in their hand, qualified teachers, that they have time to remediate, we're not serious about um, modeling fluency, like Liz said. We're not serious about really closing this gap.
Mm-hmm.
So Liz has a question. How do we shift the paradigm away from whole language towards explicit phonics and instruction? You touched on this a little bit earlier when we talked about it. Do you want to give this a little, come back with a little 1-2 about what your thoughts are about this?
Yeah, and I think it really comes down to working with teachers who are holding on to a whole language perspective. Um, I think, and this is where the risks are in the science of reading movement. I think there's too much of a risk right now of trying to tell people to do something that they don't want to do. You know what it's like when someone tells you to do something you don't believe in, right?
Yeah.
Everyone listening, imagine if like it yeah, you can imagine what that's like. If you something
Mm-hmm.
you believe in very strongly, someone comes in and says you need to stop doing it and stop doing it now and do something different. Let's kind of think about kind of nudging the ocean liner a little bit in the direction, right?
Mm-hmm.
Of saying that can we add in maybe this component for maybe 10 minutes a day? Can we add in a little bit more explicit instruction in phonics? Can we build in this in this way? And can we start there, right? I'd like to see that. There's um, obviously a lot of things that are problematic about the whole language movement, but there's also things around the importance of knowledge, around the importance of language that must continue to be a part of our reading instruction, right? So think about small steps you can take in moving a district, a teacher in the right direction. It really comes down to a bit more in terms of systematic explicit phonics instruction, and then wrapping that into the reading practice that kids are already doing,
Mm-hmm.
hopefully in those classrooms.
Yeah. I appreciate that. And one of the things that I want, so guys, I put his email address. I'm going to put it back up here again. His email address for you to reach out. We love this conversation about dyslexia because what I like is that you're giving teachers specific things they can do, and it's not just all theory. And that is super important as teachers are hopefully off this upcoming week for Thanksgiving. But as they go back into their classrooms, people can reach out to you there. Dr. Clemens, I feel like we could go another 2 hours, but we're going to respect your time and we're going to let you go. You are more than welcome if you ever want to submit a piece to us for publishing. Um, Dyslexia, I feel like in the next, it's become very popular, but I feel like as we realize so many kids are behind, I don't want to say behind, are struggling in reading because of us not using evidence based practices. I think we're
Mm-hmm.
going to continue to have these conversations. Anything, so we have 3 minutes, and I want to ask you like a fire range of questions, like 10 seconds. Are you good for it?
Mm-hmm.
We usually do this. Okay.
I'll do my best.
Uh, all right. So, very quickly, what's your favorite food to eat?
um, spaghetti and meatballs,
Okay, spaghetti and meatballs. Favorite athletic team?
ice hockey,
Best vacation?
Italy,
Oh, I love Italy. If you could do anything in the world, what would you be doing?
at the beach, at the beach with my wife and daughter.
Okay. Guys, we appreciate you guys for tuning in. Dr. Clemens, your email is here. We hopefully, guys, as you listen to these talks with researchers, it's helping you not only build your tool belt of evidence based strategies, but also us getting into the habit as teachers of reading research. Because a lot of times we're in there with 30, 45 kids, we don't have time. But this is research that we can use, we can digest. It's easy to digest. And I'll put the link to the article back into the chat so you guys can get it. And I'll put it up here and I'll also put it on the chat. But we just want to make sure that we highlight this. Good research is happening. Dr. Clemens, Have a great evening with your family, and we thank you for joining us tonight, guys. Join us next time, and if you're on our email list, you'll know. I mean, you can sign up. We had so many people signed up for tonight, so many people emailing and watching online. So thank you, guys. Have a good night.
Thanks very much. I enjoyed it.
All right, bye
Happy
bye.
Thanksgiving.
Happy Thanksgiving, also.
Bye bye.